Widow's Peak. The Oregon wind cut through Becca Thornfield's worn shawl as she stumbled down the mountain trail, her hands still shaking from what she'd been forced to do. At 48, the former schoolteacher had buried 2 husbands, raised 5 stepchildren who'd scattered like tumbleweeds, and endured 20 years of frontier hardship. But she'd never expected to kill a man with her own hands, especially not her 3rd husband's business partner, the spoff who tried to claim more than just his share of their lumber mill. The memory of the attack replayed in her mind with brutal clarity. Carl Brennan had cornered her in the back office of the mill, while her husband Thomas was away on business in Portland. The ledgers she'd been reviewing still lay open on the desk when Brennan entered, his eyes narrowed with contempt and something darker. "You're nothing but a used-up old woman," Carl Brennan had snarled as he forced her against the mill's workbench, his breath hot with whiskey and malice. "Time you learned what you're really good for." Becca had fought back with the desperate strength of a woman who'd survived too much to surrender easily. Her fingers had closed around the mill hammer, the weight of it unfamiliar, yet somehow right in her palm. The sickening crack as it connected with Brennan's skull echoed through the empty mill, followed by the heavy thud of his body hitting the sawdust floor. The lesson had ended with Brennan's skull split open, his blood pooling on the sawdust floor while Becca stood over him, trembling with shock and rage. For a long moment, she'd simply stared at what she'd done, her schoolteacher's mind cataloging details with horrifying precision, the way his fingers still twitched, the copper smell of blood mixing with pine resin, the absolute silence that followed. She'd fled into the Cascade Mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back, knowing that no jury would believe a widow's word against a respected businessman, even a dead one. Cedar Falls had always protected men like Brennan, men with money and connections who greased the right palms and bought the right loyalties. "Should have been more careful, Carl," she whispered to the wind as she navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of trail. "Should have remembered that cornered animal's bite." The mountains loomed around her, indifferent to her plight, yet somehow comforting in their ancient permanence. Becca had always loved these peaks from a distance, admiring their snow-capped majesty from the safety of town. Now they were her only refuge, their dense forests and hidden valleys, her only hope for escape. Now Becca followed a deer trail deeper into the wilderness, her schoolmarm's boots slipping on loose rocks and pine needles. Her feet were blistered and bleeding, unused to such rough travel. The elegant boots that had carried her through Cedar Falls' dusty streets were falling apart after 3 days of mountain terrain. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and thirst scratched at her throat despite the cold mountain streams she'd drunk from. In the distance, she spotted smoke rising from a hidden valley, the first sign of human habitation she'd seen since fleeing the mill town of Cedar Falls. Hope and fear warred within her. Smoke meant people, and people meant potential danger. But it also meant shelter, food, perhaps even a moment's rest before she continued her desperate flight. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs, with a well-tended garden and a small corral holding 2 sturdy horses. The structure itself was larger than Becca had expected, built of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney that sent wisps of smoke curling into the clear mountain air. Someone had taken great care with its construction, adding small touches that spoke of permanence rather than temporary shelter. Carved window frames, a covered porch with a rocking chair, flower boxes filled with hardy mountain blooms. Becca could hear the sound of an axe biting into wood, the steady rhythm of someone who knew their business. She approached cautiously, her empty stomach cramping with hunger, her schoolteacher's mind calculating risks and possibilities with each step. The woman splitting firewood looked up at Becca's approach, tall and rangy, with steel-gray hair braided down her back and eyes the color of winter sky. She wore men's clothes, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt rolled up to reveal sinewy forearms, and sturdy boots that had seen many miles. She handled the axe with the easy competence of someone who'd learned to do everything for herself, her movements economical and precise. "Well, I'll be," the woman said, setting down her axe and wiping her brow with a bandana pulled from her pocket. Her voice was deep and slightly raspy, as if unused to regular conversation. "What's a town lady doing wandering my mountains?" Becca straightened her spine, summoning the dignity that had carried her through 20 years of frontier teaching. "Running," she replied honestly, too tired for deception. "Running from something I did that I can't take back." The woman studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who'd survived by reading people quickly and accurately. Her eyes took in Becca's torn dress, her ruined boots, the haunted look that no amount of schoolteacher composure could hide. Something in Becca's bearing, the way she held herself despite her exhaustion, suggested this wasn't just another lost traveler. "Name's Ruth McKenzie," the woman said finally, extending a calloused hand. "And you look like you could use a meal and a place to sit down before you fall down." Ruth's cabin was sparse but comfortable, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books, an unusual sight in the deep wilderness. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean, and a pot of something savory smelling hanging from an iron hook. Pelts and woven blankets softened the wooden chairs and bench, while oil lamps cast a warm glow over the single room. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, preparing coffee and venison stew without unnecessary conversation. Becca sank onto a bench by the rough-hewn table, her legs finally giving out after days of desperate flight. "You kill someone?" Ruth asked matter-of-factly as she set a bowl before Becca, the steam rising from the rich stew carrying the scent of herbs and wild onions. Becca nearly choked on her first spoonful, the blunt question catching her off guard. "What makes you think that?" "You got the look, same look I had when I first came up here 15 years ago." Ruth poured coffee into 2 tin cups, adding a splash of something stronger from a flask at her belt. "That, and town women don't generally wander these mountains alone unless they're running from something serious." The story spilled out over the simple meal. Brennan's attack, the desperate struggle, the sickening crack of skull against hammer. Ruth listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if she'd heard similar tales before. Her weathered face remained impassive, but her eyes flickered with understanding and something darker when Becca described Brennan's final moments. "This Brennan," she said when Becca finished, refilling their cups with the fortified coffee. "He tried this with other women?" I think so. There were rumors, whispers. The mill girls would warn each other not to be alone with him. But he had money, influence. People looked the other way." Becca's hands tightened around her cup. "My husband Thomas never believed the stories, said Carl was just high-spirited and people misunderstood him." Ruth spat into the fire, the gesture eloquent in its contempt. "Men like that think they can take whatever they want. Sometimes they need to be taught different." She studied Becca with renewed interest. "You taught him, all right? Permanent like." Her own story emerged slowly as the evening deepened. Ruth had been married to a timber baron who'd built his fortune on the backs of Chinese workers, paying them starvation wages and working them to death in dangerous conditions. When Ruth tried to intervene, documenting the abuses and threatening to take her evidence to federal authorities, her husband had her declared mentally incompetent and locked away in an asylum. "Took me 3 years to escape," Ruth said, her voice flat with old pain as she stoked the fire. 3 years of treatments, meant to break my mind. Cold water baths, isolation, restraints, all because I wouldn't stay silent about what he was doing." Her eyes reflected the dancing flames, memories playing across her face. "When I got back, I found he'd married his secretary and sold off everything that was rightfully mine. So I decided to collect what I was owed." "You killed him?" Becca asked, both horrified and fascinated by this woman who'd carved out a life of independence in the wilderness. "I gave him the same chance he gave those Chinese workers. Some accidents happen in timber camps, falling trees, broken cables, that sort of thing." Ruth's smile was cold as mountain frost. "Turns out a man who's never done an honest day's work doesn't know to check if a load is properly secured before standing under it." Ruth had fled to the mountains with what gold she could carry, building this hidden refuge where she lived, by hunting, trapping, and the occasional visit from travelers who needed supplies or information. Over the years, she'd created a network of like-minded outcasts, people who lived beyond society's reach for reasons of their own. The law still looking for you? Becca asked, suddenly aware that she was sharing a meal with another killer. Probably. But they'd have to find me first, and these mountains don't give up their secrets easy. Ruth gestured to the cabin around them. Built this place myself, in a valley that doesn't appear on any map. The few traders who know about me keep their mouths shut because I pay well and don't ask questions about their own business. When Becca was strong enough to travel, Ruth made an unexpected offer. Winter's coming, and you got nowhere to go. Stay here, help me get ready for the cold months. Come spring, you can decide what you want to do. Why would you trust a stranger? A killer? Becca asked, suspicious of kindness after a lifetime of hard lessons. Ruth's laugh was harsh as the mountain wind. Because we're both killers now, and we both know what it's like to be hunted. Might as well be hunted together. She handed Becca a pair of worn but serviceable boots. Besides, I could use an extra pair of hands, and you look like you know how to work. Their partnership began with the hard work of preparing for a mountain winter. Becca learned to hunt, to preserve meat, to read weather signs and animal tracks. Her schoolteacher's mind proved valuable in other ways. She could calculate supplies, plan logistics, and negotiate with the occasional trader who found their hidden valley. The skills that had made her an effective teacher, patience, attention to detail, the ability to adapt, served her well in this new life. You're tougher than you look, Ruth observed after Becca successfully tracked and killed her first deer, the rifle steady in hands that had once only held chalk and books. I'm tougher than I knew, Becca replied, field dressing the animal with hands that no longer shook at the sight of blood. Maybe I always was, but never had the chance to find out. As winter deepened, they discovered they made an effective team. Ruth's knowledge of the wilderness, combined with Becca's education and organizational skills, created something neither could have achieved alone. The cabin became more comfortable under Becca's influence. Curtains appeared at the windows, shelves were reorganized for efficiency, and meals became more varied as she experimented with Ruth's stores of dried herbs and preserved foods. They began taking in other refugees. Women fleeing abusive husbands, men escaping false accusations. Anyone who needed sanctuary from a world that had turned against them. Some stayed only long enough to rest and heal before moving on. Others remained to become part of their growing community. By midwinter, 3 additional cabins had been built in the hidden valley, each housing people with their own stories of injustice and escape. The confrontation with the law came in early spring, when a territorial marshal arrived with a posse following rumors of the Widow's Peak Gang, a supposed band of female outlaws terrorizing the Oregon Territory. In reality, Ruth and Becca had occasionally ventured into distant towns to trade for supplies they couldn't produce themselves, and their growing confidence had attracted attention. Rebecca Thornfield, Marshal Hayes called out as his men surrounded the cabin, their horses nervous in the unfamiliar mountain terrain. You're wanted for the murder of Carl Brennan. Come out with your hands up. Becca stepped onto the porch, no longer the frightened schoolteacher who'd fled into the mountains months earlier. Hard living had strengthened her body, while surviving in the wilderness had hardened her spirit. She wore Ruth's style of clothing now, practical trousers, a flannel shirt, and the boots that had carried her through her new life. Marshal Hayes, she said calmly, recognizing the man from Cedar Falls. You're a long way from civilization. Not too far to bring in a killer. You're coming back to face justice. Hayes's hand rested on his holstered pistol, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest, where other members of their community might be hiding. Whose justice? Becca asked. The kind that lets men like Brennan prey on women for years without consequence? The kind that would hang me for defending myself while letting him walk free if he'd succeeded in his attack? One of the posse members, a young deputy named Collins, shifted nervously in his saddle. Ma'am, the law's the law. You can't just kill people because they... Because they what? Ruth interrupted, stepping out of the cabin with a rifle in her hands. Because they rape and murder and steal, knowing the law won't touch them? Because they have money and connections while their victims have nothing? The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Hayes's men were professionals, but they were also far from backup, facing women who'd learned to survive in country that killed the unprepared. From the surrounding forest came the subtle sounds of movement, other members of their community taking up positions ready to defend the sanctuary they'd built together. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed," Hayes said, though his hand rested on his gun butt. "No, it doesn't," came a new voice. A federal judge rode into the clearing, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. Judge Morrison was a familiar figure to Becca. He'd presided over school board meetings in Cedar Falls before his appointment to the federal bench. "Because there's not going to be any arrest today." Judge Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Marshal Hayes, I've been investigating Carl Brennan's business dealings. Turns out he was involved in land fraud, tax evasion, and a dozen other federal crimes. The territorial government's been protecting him for years." Hayes's confidence wavered. "But the murder?" "Self-defense," Morrison replied firmly. "I've interviewed 6 women who'll testify that Brennan attacked them. Mrs. Thornfield was protecting herself from a known predator." He turned to Becca, his expression softening. "You should have come to me, Rebecca. I would have helped." "Would you?" Becca asked, not unkindly. "When his partner, my husband, refused to believe what was happening in his own mill. When the town sheriff dismissed complaints from mill girls as hysterics. The law failed us long before I took it into my own hands, Judge Morrison." The posse retreated that afternoon, their authority meaningless in the face of federal intervention. Brennan's crimes had finally caught up with him, even in death. And the women he'd terrorized found their voices when they learned one of them had fought back successfully. "Feel better?" Ruth asked as they watched the lawmen disappear down the mountain trail, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. "Feel free," Becca replied. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly free." Their sanctuary in the mountains became legendary throughout the Pacific Northwest. Widow's Peak, where women could find safety and men could find justice when the law failed them. They built a community of outcasts and survivors, proving that sometimes the people society discards create the strongest bonds. "We make quite a pair," Ruth observed one evening as they sat by their fire, watching the sunset paint the Cascade peaks gold and crimson. "We make a family," Becca corrected. "The kind you choose, not the kind you're born into." At 49, Rebecca Thornfield was no longer the frightened schoolteacher who'd killed in desperation and fled into the wilderness. She was a leader, a protector, and living proof that sometimes the worst moments of your life lead to the best discoveries about yourself. The mountains that had sheltered her had also transformed her into something stronger than she'd ever imagined. A woman who'd learned that justice sometimes had to be taken rather than waited for, and that the most unlikely partnerships often created the most enduring sanctuaries. And Ruth McKenzie had found something she'd thought lost when she escaped that asylum. Not just freedom, but purpose, partnership, with someone who understood that survival required both strength and the wisdom to know when civilization's rules no longer applied. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream, in the hidden valleys of the Cascade Mountains, proving that sometimes the people society hunts become the ones who offer the truest refuge to others fleeing injustice. Widow's Peak stood as a testament to the power of women who refused to be victims, who chose to fight back when the world tried to break them, and who discovered that the strongest communities are built by those who understand what it means to have nowhere else to go.